All right, and here we are again live streaming to Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So, whichever platform you're on, there's an opportunity you can write some comments in, and we'll be able to see those here live on the show and hopefully be able to answer any questions or take any comments you have. So, please feel free to engage. But thanks for joining us on the Lead with Data show. Today I've got a guest I am so very excited to have on the show. Preet Gill. He and I worked together a few years ago, and he was a fantastic mentor to me as I was getting my start in not just engineering data, but working with business data as well. So, welcome, Preet, and I'll give you a chance
Thank
here
you.
to give a short little introduction to yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew, for having me. And I also cherish the time we spent together working on interesting projects. So, again, thank you for having me on the show. Um, my name is Preet Gill, and if you don't already pick from my accent, I'm originally from India, but I've spent half my life in the States. Um, a naturalized citizen now. Um, Proud of that, by the way. Um, but in my day job these days, I work on various strategy topics for Bosch. It's a multi-national conglomerate which works on mobility topics, consumer goods, household appliances, consumer goods in general, industrial applications. So I'm in a corporate role. I get to look at various aspects of Bosch, trying to analyze and understand and eventually synthesize strategic options for the company to see if it makes sense for Bosch to occupy a certain space in the marketplace. So yeah, that's a quick background there.
Yeah. So glad to have you on the show. We had this really interesting conversation as we were prepping for this show about sort of the way you initially learn about data in school. And
Mhm,
then once you get into the real world, you find out how malleable data ends up being.
mhm,
So it
mhm,
almost, everybody likes to think of data as being very objective. You can just collect data, you run it through some averages, variances, or, simple statistical stuff, and then boom,
mhm,
there comes answers. Uh, but it ends up being a much longer process or a much more convoluted process to get to real valuable insights out of that data. Um, do you remember one of those earliest times, Preet, when you kind of felt that power of data, or at least, if not the power, the challenges of working with data?
yeah, for sure. I mean, in our lives, for most of us, or I guess a big percentage of us around the globe, math is something which we get introduced to pretty early, right? Earliest day
Yeah.
of kindergarten for those of us who have young kids, or if you remember, if you have memory from that time, math and numbers are introduced very early. Um, this is how one way we quantify our world, and we incrementally grow or develop our understanding of numbers. And like you said, for the most part, we are, as we used to call back in India, plugging and chugging. So you understand the formula, you get the numbers, and here's the output. But over time, if you work with data long enough, you start to understand that the data context is important. My earliest memory of where I really had an epiphany of this malleability of data, if we can call it that, was graduate school at U of M. I have
Mm.
my shirt on.
Yeah.
It was a time series class, and we were learning about something called ARMA modeling. It is autoregressive moving averages. And we had a class project, and the professor had given us independence of choosing any data set as long as it was autoregressive, right? So it is a time series, and then come up with conclusions. And sure enough, I dug up some data related to temperature changes, global temperature changes, and amount of carbon in the air. So, as most of us would agree, all of us should agree that this relation should be directly correlational, right? So, more carbon should be higher temperature. And as I found out that my model wrongly quantified that, it showed an inverse proportion. So
Oh.
now I I sat there and scratched my head and didn't know what to do. and it was late, and the thing was due on the next day, and I submitted it as is with a big set of caveats that this seems wrong, it's incorrect. And the next day, when I was making the presentation, um, between the time I submitted it and between the time I went to the presentation, I dug up and I really found that the context was wrong, the time series was off, as well as it was not, let's call it, broad enough.
Mm,
These were averages, and averages were really what was throwing me off. So if you think about it, we've been targeting 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, which could be catastrophic. And you think about it, right? Your thermostat has much bigger error inside your house. It really doesn't feel much. So that context of whether it's a house or the whole planet and how you're averaging it and how you're presenting those data, I think really matters. And
yeah.
anyone who is going to be dealing with data then needs to remember that context is how I would, um, uh, is my big lessons learned, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I know one of the things that I struggled with when I got into industry and out of academia was, yes, the context of the data isn't always there, but there's also very dirty data, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
the data that
Yes.
you get is very rarely in the real world nice, clean, and
Correct.
organized for you. There's a lot of work to be done there
Mm-hmm.
just to be able to start on the problem. But especially once you start getting into business stuff, sort of like the business development work that you do, the sort of, I don't know if you'd call it scarcity of the data,
Mm-hmm.
also
Mm-hmm.
starts to become an issue where you can't just plug and chug using
Mm-hmm.
artificial intelligence or something to come up with the next
Mm-hmm.
big business idea. You really have
Mm-hmm.
to do more of this subjective data analysis as opposed to having objective measurements that you're doing some sort of a procedure on.
Mm-hmm. There are several things which come to mind right now. So one thing, Andrew, I think we've discussed this. Several of the opinions which I'm going to express are from my own personal experience, my professional experience, not necessarily from Bosch. So maybe
Right.
the audience should understand that. Uh, but your point is absolutely correct. So on one side we have, um, actually, I remember an anecdote. I don't know if you remember or not. One of the tasks we had was creating this report for CES for the board. And
Oh,
I
yes.
remember you and I had this big breakfast, and we walked on to the in Vegas. If people know Vegas, buffets are huge. We
Yes.
walked on the street and we looked up, and there was a plane with a banner. I don't know the number, and then said, this is a massive amount of data we generate now, and this was 4 years ago, 5 years ago now. Uh, and so on the one hand, we have a lot of data. On the other hand, we have very little data, like you said, in business settings, especially for new areas. But I think a wise thing for practitioners, I guess, in this space is to uh, one, be creative.
Mm,
So how can we use the data we have today and make it stand in for something else, right? So we can already start to use that knowledge. Um, so one topic we can think about is, let's say you wanted to enter into, I don't know, luxury furniture, which is also smart. And if I just give you those keywords, there might not be a lot of business related analytics. But then again, there is a lot of furniture related analytics. There is a lot of IoT related analytics, or I shouldn't
mm,
say analytic data and analytics. And then you can pick topics from there and then maybe apply it to your field. Yes, it is a simplistic example, but the point I'm trying to make is if are a lot of data sets out there, think creatively how those would impact your business and if some valuable information could be generated. Now, on the
right.
flip side of things, where there isn't enough data, or call it, quantitative or qualitative data, this is where we should get ready to now do the primary research, surveys, interviews, focus group, whatever that might be, to start building to that context we were talking about before.
Yeah, yeah, I love that idea of using almost like adjacent data sets, right? Like with the
Exactly.
the smart furniture sort of example, there's plenty of data in the furniture industry
Hmm.
that, with some good questioning of the data, right? Is this
Mhm.
particular part of the data set applicable if I were to be focusing it towards smart furniture? Then yeah, you can end up getting stuff. You can end up getting yourself some data sets at much lower effort than
Exactly.
doing that original research yourself. But how how do you end up finding the right questions to ask about that data then though, right? Like,
Mhm.
so you've got an
Mhm.
adjacent data set that doesn't perfectly fit your use case.
Mhm.
Do you have like a sort of approach to figuring out, okay, what are those right questions to ask of the data?
Mhm. Um, my approach, I like to talk in analogies. My approach typically is the self-correcting loop, right? So these control PIM models or whatever, right, where you have a feedback and a feed forward loop, and
Yeah.
you are somehow able to self-correct yourself. So let's say you do start with adjacent data. We already know it's not accurate, but it is something, right? It is better than zero. It is better than making a total guess. So this is where I would try to underscore the importance of domain experts
Mm,
and users. So domain experts would be people who might work for DOE, Department of Energy, or a university professor, or I don't know, an expert furniture delivery guy who's been delivering art van is not around, Gardner White furniture for 20, 30 years, and they exactly know what people would expect or what you would expect when people call you to your house. So that's the expert. And if you think about this in terms of bell curve, and my hands are on the edges of the bell curve, so your experts would give you a well-rounded view of the world, and then bring you to the middle, right? So now you are slowly coming to the middle of the bell curve. And once you are coming closer and closer to the kind of true north, now you can start to engage with your users. So closer to the middle of the bell curve is where your users will exist. And um, that's an approach of self-correction, which I've used, and I've seen others use. Where um, where you can always you can never have a positivistic view of the world, right? So you cannot be absolutely correct, but you
yeah.
can be as correct as possible if you start relying on experts and users and use that, I guess, information or set of impulses smartly is how I would describe that.
Right. Now, if it's now, what I'm thinking about, what that's making me think about is in these industries where what you're trying to do is maybe so different or so new that yes, there are adjacencies to your industry, but maybe the experts don't have that sort of context, or probably more realistically, there's differing opinions about what
Hmm.
things look like and how to transfer over sort of that domain knowledge.
Hmm.
And where I'm going with that is, to me, that sounds like a recipe for either scope creep or just running on the treadmill trying to figure out what's there, but you're kind of I always think of gradient descent, right? Like, you're
Hmm.
trying to
Hmm.
find your way down to the bottom of the valley, but we're taking such big steps because there's missing information from the domain experts that you can't find that bottom.
Right, right.
Um,
So, so I the way I would respond to that, Andrew, is research is should never be in a vacuum. Otherwise, you get to that treadmill, which which you can. It's a never-ending loop.
yep.
And and I think one way to counter that, a very, I guess, practical way to counter that, is to look at your client. You're always researching for a client. If it is a national lab, it is researching for, I guess, the rest of us. If it is um, a consulting house, it is providing input to a certain, I guess, industry partner or a business a type of business. And so from that standpoint, you have to put the client, I guess, in front. And the other place of discipline could be, um, not every time could be a timeline, right? So you need to be able to say that in such and such time, I need to be able to get to a certain conclusion. So, where the client would give you more or less a set of requirements, what they're looking for. Um, uh, and again, there could be circumstances where you can step out of there, but the urgency can also be brought in by time pressure. What I've seen is
Mm,
if there is a project which says, okay, get me an answer when you have the best answer, then I will really put in the time and I might not get the right answer. But if I have an urgency, I need to deliver in 3 months. Somehow, I guess it is a human nature. You intuitively start to get to a more concrete set of conclusions. So those two things I cannot very concretely describe, I guess, but they always help you get less random in your search. Does that
yeah,
make sense?
yeah. Yeah, that especially
Yeah.
that last thing you were talking about to me sounds very much like that sort of agile methodology of handling iteration with time boxing, right?
Exactly.
Like
Exactly right.
you can
Very
iterate
well said.
until the end of the world comes, and maybe
Hmm.
it's getting better, maybe it's not. But as long as you're time boxing it and having these like frequent check-ins with your client, as you were mentioning,
Hmm.
say, hey,
Yes.
here's the best answer I have for you right now,
Hmm.
because I don't. I'm sure you find this in your work too. When you do come up for air with some sort of results, you almost always get more questions than what you first had when you were diving in looking for answers, right? And sometimes
Hmm.
those questions end up being more valuable ones to answer than what you initially set out to go find insights on.
Yeah, this is absolutely correct, and I think in our previous conversations we've touched upon this a lot. Is once you get a abstract question from your client and you are going to go look for concrete answers for that abstract question, don't just disappear. Make sure you come back and, like you said, come up for air and see how they reflect or what are they thinking. This addresses the malleability topic we were touching upon, the context topic we were touching upon before. Um, but then also this gives you that that set of bearings you would need to continue your research, right? So they might tell you of a scope change, and if you were gone for 6 months and you missed that scope change, I hope that's not that drastic. But frequent check-ins, um, for plausibility, for rationality, I think also are, I think, one of the keys to success for sure.
Right, yeah. And another thing that you're reminding me that we were talking about earlier is this idea of those frequent check-ins being very helpful for when you start getting closer towards like that end phase of the project where you end up having
Hmm.
to deliver something
Hmm.
uh, to the customer, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So if you just
Yeah.
disappear for 6 months and then come up with your answer, the odds that even if you're right?
Hmm.
Like if you come up with
Exactly.
good
Yeah.
insights, the right business, or if you're doing business development, or the right answers if you're looking through data, you might even come to the right answer if you disappear and don't stay aligning along the way. But the
Hmm.
delivery of that could end up causing that whole thing to fail anyway, right?
Hmm. Absolutely. I would draw an analogy to uh, a PhD dissertation, right? So you
Mm,
typically, and if we can sum it up that way. So typically, you'll have three people on your committee. You'll have your advisor, and you're always working with your advisor. This person, she or he, would be guiding you along the way. But every now and then, you also check in with your committee members. So that is kind of a client. But I think towards the end, when you deliver the end product, hopefully it's not 6 months when you deliver your products. I would also think of this as some sort of defense, as a dissertation defense. So it's not one way boring PowerPoint. I would, I have started to now think about how can I engage my client so that they can take what I've researched for them and then created options for them and on the basis of this research, and then they can start to apply it to their business and where real difference starts to happen. um, Many times what happens is, it is one time delivery and then you walk away, and then who does the implementation? So this handover of your conclusions to your client, whoever internal, external that might be, is, I think, one of the most important, if not the most important, I guess, step in this process. And typically, what I have been successful with is holding a workshop and breaking down my findings into individual chunks, which we address in these workshops, and letting them ask questions, letting them poke holes,
Mm.
because uh, it's not personal to me, right? Hopefully I've done my research, I've done my due diligence where I can stand on something, but then inherently what it does for them is they now start to somehow attach themselves to the findings. Maybe
Uh,
it is an aversion, I don't know, but they'll start to develop that appreciation of what I've found. And maybe it is positive or negative, doesn't matter, but that appreciation is really, really, I think, the most important thing a data scientist or business analyst, whatever, can do for their client. Um, and this handover of information, I think, is really, really critical. If everything is in my mind, what good does it do, right? Nothing. Uh,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I really like that point because, um, yeah, it's almost kind of like some you're soliciting for some buy-in too, right,
Yes.
into the
Yes.
ideas, as
Hmm.
opposed to just here's the report out, you can read through, and now we've just summarized things for you,
Hmm.
so you don't have to do the work. Instead, what you're saying is, hey, we've gone this far in the journey, and I'm catching you up to speed because, as you said, sometimes that's kind of the end of the road with the current client, right? And
Hmm.
they have
Hmm.
to take it going forward. It's not enough to just give them context.
Hmm.
They have to have, that sort of buy-in. And I think really importantly too, what you mentioned is asking questions about
Hmm.
what the results were, because there's a part of working with data and business development that you have to inherently ask a lot of questions,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
hopefully a lot of good questions,
Right.
but at
Exactly.
least a lot of questions. And if you're not getting that and you're just handing over a report, um, yeah, the odds
Yeah.
are it's probably going to flop potentially a little bit.
Yes.
We
Exactly.
did get our first comment coming in from this
All
from
right.
Tony Ruiz. Loving the conversation topic. One thing that organizations should drive to is developing that data first culture, prioritizing exploration to avenues to find answers they are looking for. Data first culture.
Mm-hmm.
That is something I'm hearing more and more of in the last few years here.
I think the keyword for me, yes, we are talking in the context of data. Um, we say lead with data. That's the name of the program here. But I think the word culture is very
Mm,
important. Uh, yes, we can take a quantum computer if we can get a hand on it and then crunch the entire world's data sets and get some very interesting and sometimes very implausible results. Uh, but
like
these results,
42,
yeah,
right?
right, right. Um, and I think culture is very, very important in to to put everything into perspective. Um, the kind of conclusions which I might get from data, um, and the strategy which I will develop from that, by the way, has to exist in a type of a culture. And as you might remember, Andrew, the culture at Bosch is very distinct, a certain way, and culture at Google would be entirely different. The culture where was born and the culture where the place I chose to call home is entirely different.
Mm,
And yes, the numbers 2 plus 2 is always 4, but that doesn't sit in a vacuum, right? So you have to be able to understand the culture in which you are interpreting results. I'm not trying to say that biases your analysis, but it surely influences the strategic options you might come up with based on your analysis.
right.
And I think that is also important. Again, going back to this handover, I think the culture impacts the handover. That's the point.
Yeah, it impacts the handover you're mentioning, but it sounded like there you're saying also throughout the whole process, maybe the
Correct.
sorts
Correct.
of questions
Yes.
that you're asking
Mhm.
and I mean, if we're going to be talking, I mean, you mentioned specifically bias as maybe not the only thing to take away from that, but uh, when you're doing business development stuff, that's all about relationships with people
Absolutely.
that you develop too.
Hmm.
And there's definitely a
Great point.
cultural component to working with other people and the context and cultures that they're in, whether that's work culture or geographically speaking,
Hmm.
and that can do a lot of stuff to the data and the insights and the results that you're looking to present in the end as well. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's a sort of
Hmm.
all-encompassing sort of practice.
Exactly, exactly. I think one other thing, I was looking at the title here last time when we talked lead with data. I think there's a verb, there's a noun, and I think there is another noun. Who is leading data, right?
Mm,
It's us, yes, the analysts, along with, I would say, domain experts who can really use their cultural knowledge, their context, and then jointly be able to get to some points, right? If we were just doing number crunching, there is no fun in that. I think having that domain expertise of sorts, maybe not from yourself, from others, you can ask questions like you said. I think also adds really good value to this whole endeavor.
yeah, the value of domain experts is just so high for anybody working with data. So I imagine you have a very similar experience working with different clients internally and otherwise, as myself as an independent consultant going around working with different companies,
Hmm.
and that you don't always work within, taking from my past here, the railroad industry, right? Like the
Hmm.
longer you spend time in the railroad industry, the more domain knowledge you have and the more
Right.
effective you can be. Uh, Not in a vacuum, but you can be a lot more self sufficient when you build
Yes.
up that time in an industry.
Hmm.
But when you're interfacing with a bunch of different industries, the value of domain experts is just so incredibly powerful that without them, like, so if you're doing a consulting project with another company and they're not providing that domain expert, you can't really expect any sort of valid data analysis to come out of that,
Hmm.
except perhaps by chance. But
Right. Right.
I wouldn't want to run
You
my business on chance.
right. Exactly. You could, if you're McKinsey of the world, not to name names, right? I'm just using them as an example. A big consulting firm,
Right.
you might have these people on your payroll,
Mm.
some of the domain experts, but then they're also removed from the action for X number of years, right? So I think there is still value um, of getting, you know, from somewhere this more fresh domain expertise, which can then help guide you along the way. I think this cannot be overstated. The importance of domain expert here.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about the domain experts, but you also mentioned earlier on customer. So we've mentioned that as a client, right? The person
Hmm.
you're potentially doing work for. But a lot of times, the business venture or the insights that businesses are looking for are related to customers or
Mm.
customer
End
segments.
user, yeah.
And perhaps maybe they do fall under domain expert because who's a better expert on a customer than the customer themselves?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
there's
Yeah,
not always that practice when you're going through the data as well as interfacing the customer in their context.
yeah, 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 totally. Goes back to the discussion we were just having about this bell curve, right? So,
Right.
going back to that topic, and you're at the ends, you talk to your experts, domain experts, they somehow align the data for you. And your first set of analyses typically are a set of hypotheses, right? Which are smart hypotheses based grounded in data, hopefully. But to validate those hypotheses, now you really start to want to talk to the users, right? And this was the
Mm.
middle of the bell curve I was trying to mention. And these people really would help validate whatever you might have found. So your data might be pointing X percentage of, uh, you know, men over a certain age would buy this golf club, right? So your experts have told you this, your past data has told you this. If you haven't talked to that, uh, I guess, demographic now, there is no way for you to verify. You're still guessing, with a high percentage of confidence, still guessing. So it's always advisable to now talk to those customers and users, as whatever that right term is, to be able to validate your hypotheses, which you might have come up based on your initial research. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that applies a lot more than just to doing business, like trying to find new businesses itself or make a new product. I've been looking into or chatting with a bunch of marketers lately as they're looking at using their data. And one of the things that they drive from all this is, yeah, you've got all these vanity metrics of likes and views and all that type of stuff, but if you can't get down to actual like dollar value of your customers getting all the way through the click funnel,
Hmm.
essentially, you have nothing to measure, right?
Correct.
Like you don't have any sort of guiding light to figure out if what you're doing is making an improvement or not. That sort of self-feedback loop
Hmm.
of validating your previous hypotheses, whether they've changed or not, because
Correct.
a lot of
Hmm.
the environments that we're trying to make decisions in aren't static. They
Correct.
change over time, and so you have to consistently be going back and rechecking, are we
Hmm.
still on the right track here or
Right.
not?
Exactly. Exactly. Um, this might sound onerous, constant checking back, but think about, you know, um, building the Tower of Pizza at an angle and getting to the tippy top, as opposed to when you were still at the foundation and checking. It's much easier.
Yeah. Man, I love your analogies. I can see why you spent some time teaching some courses, right? Because
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah, yeah.
people learn best by analogies, and usually
Exactly.
my analogies are not as colorful and as insightful as yours.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, so when you were going through your education, did
Mm.
you plan or anticipate that you were going to land where you are today, working with sort of more of a business development sort of analysis role?
Yeah. The honest answer there, Andrew, is no. I'm going to keep it very short. No, no, no. I'll
Okay,
give you a little bit more detail
moving on.
there. I, uh, I'm an engineer, right? So I love engineering, and the science and the math and the numbers behind it are very fascinating for me. And this was one reason why I started to teach, because I didn't want to lose that proximity to what's happening, let's say at the first law of thermodynamics level, right, at the entropy level. Um, but along the way, what I started to realize is, um, I also uh, am interested in the trajectory of technology deployment. Uh, if if I know the Carnot cycle for refrigeration, and refrigeration is changing, where it is becoming more and more efficient, how does this, and I, just because of the exposure I had to various industries and groups, started to become more and more curious about that other end of technology, right? Not creating the solution so much, but how they will be used, who will use them, what would be their
Mm,
impact, when will they be used. Those kind of questions started to become bigger and bigger for me. And as I was working on my PhD, the concentration I chose was engineering management, because that's the topic now I started to become more and more interested in. Um, and that's where really, then I started to look at um, less of technical research, I would call it, but uh, more of applied research within the context of market and business, as opposed to trying to find uh, through machine vision if epilepsy patient is sick or not. Trying to understand the context of that within business. How can I now translate that into a solution for which hospitals or insurances would pay?
yeah, I'm nodding along here because I'm just having flashbacks to when we were working together because I was going through a lot of those same sort of questions a few years back where, yeah, I just come out of an engineering program. I was all psyched about working on self-driving vehicles and things of that nature, and then you catch wind
Hmm.
of what the greater context of that technology is, how it's being used in society and businesses, And yeah, the questions that come out of that, and almost like skating to where the puck is going, or at least trying
Correct.
to paint that picture and try to figure out new way, not like the like you were saying, not the deep technology of way it gets implemented, but how it might be used,
Hmm.
become really
Hmm.
interesting questions
Hmm.
that yeah, it's kind of a weird transition to go from the deeply technical to the the more business side of it without
Hmm.
losing touch
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
the math. At
Right,
least
right.
that's what it is for me.
Exactly, exactly. Hey, math is always there, right? So
Yeah.
today, if you wanted to do text mining using Python, you still need math.
Yeah, just not as much calculus anymore,
Right,
which
right.
is, for all intents and purposes, probably a good thing.
Mhm. We could disagree. We could agree to disagree.
I mean, calculus is still cool, but I don't want to be doing like triple integrals anymore and
Oh yeah,
calculating
right.
things over a field and
Right. It's not without pain. I agree with
yes.
that one.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I don't know about you, but when it was the combination of all those trigonometric identities
Mhm.
with calculus, I think it was Calc 2 if you're going through a
Mhm.
university here in the
Right, right.
United States. That was the hardest one for
Yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah,
I never liked that combination of trig and calc.
yeah, yeah. It gets complicated, but I think if you go through it and survive to tell the tales like you and I are doing, I think we did pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, then it ended up coming back to bite me because when I was in the railroad industry,
Ah,
so shouldn't say it came back to bite me because I got through it as you said and was
yeah.
able to apply it then. But the projects that I was working on were things like the rail profile and how
Mhm.
the steel in the rail wears down over time. And so the whole problem was using computer vision to match up that rail.
Mm,
And
mm,
so the big business question is this rail profiling system good?
mm,
How do you quantify how good a rail profile system is if there's dozens upon dozens of types of rail and
mm,
you don't know what rail you're looking at?
mm.
So that's where all that calculus and trig
Came
meshed
back.
together in my world to figure out what rail am I looking at and am I measuring it well?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think the within this context, I just want to make one quick comment there.
Yeah.
Uh, this so we've talked a lot about handover and constant checking. I think the leading edge of data, right? So starting with this abstract question, right? What is the business of Rails? I think that's what you said. Or
Yeah.
uh,
What's a good rail profile system?
what is a good Rail profile system? That is totally abstract. That's something what a client would say, for example, right?
Yeah.
And then the transition from that to your actual research questions, where now you're thinking about trigonometry or calculus and trying to match those things. I think that's also a real, I would say, almost say art, but you can develop this. You can develop
Mm.
this skill. Skill is a better word of going from abstract to concrete, because that also determines what kind of data will you look for to find answers, for example.
Yeah. And I feel like that's one thing that I hear talked about occasionally when I'm working with other people involved in data, but I don't see that sort of emphasis on the educational component, right? Like if somebody's out there and they're like, okay, I want to change my career or I want to continue developing my career to become a data scientist or business analyst or things of that nature, there's a million and one tutorials out there to learn how to use Power BI,
Mm,
how to do gradient descent stuff or apply the latest deep learning neural
mm-hmm,
networks. And there's not a lot of education, or at least free education out there, on here are very abstract questions
right.
that you need to go figure out not just the solution, but like the methodology to get to
Mm,
that solution. I think the closest thing that I've seen is maybe that sort of Kaggle competition stuff, although
mm,
those
mm,
parameters are usually really
mm,
clearly defined. But if you go and check out all those data sets, there's a bunch there that there's really no questions being asked. It's just
mm.
here's a bunch of data. What do you want to mess
Yeah,
around and figure out? And I
yeah.
think that might be a good way for people to to start developing that skill set you mentioned of going
hmm
from the abstract to the concrete.
hmm hmm And then also this, my my one other thought, and I deliberately try to address this, is when I do get an abstract question, I ask questions back to the person who gave me the abstract question so I can get to a little bit more. So, again, going back to requirements engineering from the engineering days, right? So,
Yeah.
you have to start thinking, asking them more questions, trying to start your investigation right there, but then also don't be shy about asking questions from others. Um, I think we as a species rely on each other all the time, and there is nothing stopping us from relying on each other for these kind of questions too, right? So
Yeah.
um, we, yeah, we look at our GPS all the time. That's relying on something else to take you throughout the world, right? Why not, develop your own GPS of people who can help you, who will guide you along the way,
I love that. Build your own GPS of people.
right?
That's
Yeah,
great.
exactly.
Ah,
Yeah,
your analogies, man. I miss them.
maybe you should talk more.
Yeah. All right, touche, touche.
Yeah,
All right, well, this has been a fantastic chat and hopefully
mhm,
episode for everybody else who's been tuning in and listening. Thank you so much, Preet, for
absolutely.
offering up the very, very helpful tips on how to make your projects, specifically data-related projects, more successful. I know I've always benefited from your wisdom on that.
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and it's great to be able to share your thoughts in more relaxed atmosphere. Still virtual, but thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And if you'll just hang on a moment, I'm going to close out the stream and we can do a
Okay.
very quick debrief. So,
All right.
all
Very
right,
good.
thank
I'm
you so
here.
much.
All
Take
right.
care,
See ya.
everyone.